Every door in town just slammed on her. Then a stranger walked up in the snow and said 5 words that changed her life. "I've got a spare room." No questions. No judgment. Just that. "Stay with me, this one's going to get you." A whole town threw her out into a storm. One quiet rancher took her in anyway, no questions asked. But this isn't really about the Old West. It's about what happens when someone stops asking, "What did you do?" and starts asking, "Are you okay?" Most of us have been on one side of that question. Maybe both. Let's get into it. The freight wagon rattled into Frostbine Hollow just as the sun gave up for the day. The wheels groaned over ice-packed ruts, and the wind coming down off the ridge was the kind that goes straight through a coat like it isn't even there. Inside that wagon sat a woman named Josephine Hart, 30 years old, her hands so cold she'd stopped feeling her own fingers an hour back. She'd been riding for 2 days straight, and every mile had felt like running from something instead of heading towards something. The driver pointed through the snow with 2 fingers. "Town's there," he said. "Last stop before the pass closes." Josephine climbed down, boots sinking into snow past her ankles. The town looked small and tired, smoke drifting up from chimneys, lantern lights spilling out of a saloon somewhere down the street. The driver handed her a folded letter of recommendation, tipped his hat, and was gone before she could even say thank you properly. And just like that, she was standing alone in the middle of Main Street, one suitcase, no plan, and nowhere warm to go. Now here's the thing you have to understand about Josephine. She wasn't running because she'd done something wrong. She was running because everyone around her had already decided she had, and there's no arguing with a town that's made up its mind. She saw the inn glowing warm at the end of the street and, for one dangerous second, let herself believe she might actually get to rest tonight. She pushed through the door. Heat hit her face. The smell of coffee and wet wool and stew filled the room. Conversations dropped to a hush. Heads turned. Behind the counter stood a woman named Ruth Holloway, built solid, gray hair pinned back tight, the kind of woman who ran her in like a fortress. Josephine offered her the recommendation letter and asked, politely, if there might be a room. Ruth read the letter. Her face changed. She read the city name at the bottom out loud like it was an accusation. St. Louis. The room went dead silent. Someone near the stove laughed under their breath. "I heard about you," Ruth said. And just like that, whatever reputation had chased Josephine 2 days across the territory had somehow beaten her to this tiny town in the middle of nowhere. "You should ask somewhere that welcomes your kind," Ruth told her, and grabbed the suitcase off the floor, and shoved it back out through the door so hard it toppled sideways into the snow. Nobody in that room said a word in her defense. Not one person. Here's a detail worth sitting with. It wasn't the shove that hurt Josephine the most. It was the silence after it. When a whole room watches something unfair happen and nobody says anything, that silence is its own kind of cruelty. Most of us have felt that silence at least once, maybe not from a hotel owner, but from a group chat that went quiet, a family dinner where nobody spoke up, a room where you needed one person to say, "That's not fair," and nobody did. Josephine bent down in the snow to grab her suitcase, throat burning, telling herself she would not cry in front of these people. Not again. Not in another town full of strangers who felt better about themselves by feeling worse about her. That's when she noticed him. A tall man standing near the hitching post, dark coat dusted white with snow, one hand resting easy on the reins of a black horse. He'd clearly been standing there the entire time. Watching. Not laughing. Not judging. Just watching with a stillness that felt completely different from everyone else in that inn. When Ruth shut the door behind her hard enough to rattle the windows, the wind hit Josephine like a slap. She crouched by her suitcase, brushing snow off the cracked leather, hands shaking. Boots crunched behind her. She straightened up fast. The man stopped a few feet away. Up close he looked to be somewhere in his mid-30s, a weathered face, dark stubble, eyes the gray color of wood smoke under the brim of his hat. He glanced at her suitcase, then at the inn behind her, and understood the whole situation without needing to ask a single question. "I've got a spare room," he said. That was it. No pity in his voice. No warning about what people would say. No questions about St. Louis or Ruth or any of it. Just 5 plain words drifting out into the freezing air. Josephine stared at him, genuinely forgetting for a second how to respond. "You don't know me," she finally managed. "Name's Caleb Whitfield," he said, low and rough, like a man who wasn't in the habit of wasting words on anything. He nodded once toward the dark road heading out of town. "Storm's getting worse." She looked back at the warm windows of the inn, shadows moving inside, people eating supper and pretending not to watch what was happening outside in the cold. Then she looked down at her own hands, white-knuckled around that suitcase handle. And something inside her nearly broke open right there in the street. Not because she was being rescued, but because after months of slammed doors and turned backs and whispered judgments, one single person had just spoken to her like she was simply a human being standing in the cold. Nothing more, nothing less. Caleb lifted her suitcase before she could argue, tied it behind his saddle, and offered his hand to help her up. She hesitated only a second before placing her frozen fingers into his glove. His grip was steady. Warm. She climbed up behind him, and the horse turned north, and neither of them said a word as the town disappeared behind the falling snow. The ride out to Whitfield Ridge Ranch took almost 40 minutes through dark timber and open frozen pasture, the wind moaning low across the ground like it was alive. Josephine sat carefully behind Caleb, one hand braced against the saddle, careful not to hold on to him more than she needed to. Finally lights appeared through the trees. The ranch sat low under the shadow of the mountains, a barn leaning against the wind, smoke curling thin from the chimney of the main house. Caleb dismounted first and reached for her suitcase before she could even climb down. "Careful," he said. "Wood freezes slick this time of year." Inside, the house smelled like pine smoke and coffee and leather, and something faintly sweet underneath it all, dried apples, she guessed. The warmth nearly hurt after so many hours out in the cold. At the far end of the kitchen table sat a boy, maybe 9 years old, curled under a blanket with a book open in front of him that he clearly wasn't really reading. He looked up when the door opened, studied Josephine for a long, serious second, then nodded once and went back to his book. "That's all he says?" Josephine asked, before she could stop herself. Something close to amusement crossed Caleb's face. "Most days." He led her down a narrow hallway to a small room just past the pantry. A cot sat under the window with a thick wool blanket folded neatly on top. There was a wash basin, fresh water already in the pitcher, a clean towel, even a pair of worn gloves set beside the basin. Not charity. Preparation. Somebody had planned for her to arrive here, even though nobody could have known she would. "Used to belong to my wife," Caleb said quietly, looking around the room. "She did her sewing in here." Josephine lowered her eyes. "I can sleep somewhere else if that's difficult." "It's just a room," he said, no sharpness in it at all. He knelt at the little iron stove and struck a match against his boot heel, an orange light bloomed slowly in the grate. "You'll be warm enough once that catches." She watched his hands while he worked, rough, scarred across the knuckles, slow and sure with simple things. When the fire steadied he stood, told her supper was on the stove if she wanted it, and left her alone with the wind pressing against the walls. That night, Josephine lay awake listening to sounds she didn't recognize yet, wind against the siding, horses shifting in the barn, wood settling in the cold. Then, sometime after midnight, she heard coughing. Not ordinary coughing. Sharp. Tight. Frightened. She was up and out the door before she'd even decided to move. Caleb stood in the hallway carrying the boy, whose whole small body was shaking with every strained breath. For the first time since she'd met him, real fear showed plainly on Caleb's face. "He can't catch his breath," he said. "Get water boiling," Josephine told him, already moving. She knelt beside the boy near the kitchen stove and loosened the blanket around his chest. "Easy now," she whispered. "Don't fight the breathing." She opened her medicine bag and pulled out a small cloth pouch of dried herbs, mint, eucalyptus, wild horehound, and dropped them into the steaming water Caleb brought her, guiding the boy close to the rising steam. Minutes passed. Then more. Slowly, painfully, the tightness in his chest began to ease. Caleb crouched beside them the whole time, one hand pressed so hard against the table edge his knuckles had gone white. "How long's he had this?" Josephine asked quietly. "Since last winter," Caleb said. "Doctor came through once. Said cold air makes it worse." Eventually the boy's breathing loosened enough that he leaned weakly against Josephine's shoulder and fell asleep right there near dawn, while the kettle steamed quietly beside them. Caleb stood across the kitchen watching them in the low firelight. Neither of them said anything. But something in that lonely ranch house shifted for the first time in years. Here's the part I want you to notice, because it's easy to miss. Josephine had no reason left in the world to trust anyone. She'd just been humiliated in front of a whole town hours earlier. But the second a child needed help, none of that mattered to her. That's not a small thing. That's the difference between someone who's been hurt and gives up on people, and someone who's been hurt and still shows up anyway. Keep that in your back pocket, because it comes back around later. By morning the storm had passed, leaving the pasture buried under smooth white drifts. Over coffee, Caleb told her a little more, that his wife had passed 3 winters back, that she'd known some home remedies but not enough, not when it mattered most. Josephine noticed the careful way he talked about grief, like a man stepping out onto ice that might not hold his weight. Later that day, a deputy named Beckett Lowe rode up to the ranch with a letter from St. Louis, and in front of Caleb and the boy, he laid out exactly why the whole town already knew Josephine's name before she'd even arrived. A wealthy merchant named Harlan Voss had cornered her at a dinner party. She'd fought him off. His wife had walked in at the wrong moment and believed the version of the story that hurt less. Not long after, the man's own guilt caught up with him and he was gone for good, and somehow, in the eyes of everyone who mattered, that made it Josephine's fault. Caleb didn't flinch. He just asked the deputy one question, "You finished?" and showed him the door. That evening, alone with Caleb by the stove, Josephine finally told him the truth in her own words. "I fought him off," she said. His wife believed what was easier. Caleb didn't look at her with pity. Just attention. "And did you ruin him?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded once and went back to sharpening his knife, and somehow that simple, unshowy acceptance unsettled her more than anger ever could have. Then, near dusk the next day, the boy went missing. He'd taken a young horse out to bring it in before the weather turned, and the gate was hanging open, and nobody had seen him in over an hour. Caleb and Josephine rode out into a wall of blowing snow, following one small set of tracks up toward the ridge. They found him crouched by a half-collapsed hunting shack, cold and frightened but alive, his horse having slipped and refused to go on. Caleb dropped from the saddle so fast the snow burst under his boots, pulling the boy hard against his chest. "You don't ever do this again," he said, his voice breaking around the edges. "You hear me?" And that's when they heard it. A groan from inside the shack. Deputy Beckett Lowe, half-conscious, leg broken beneath a collapsed section of roof, having tried to beat the storm home and lost. Josephine knelt beside him without a second's hesitation, cutting away fabric with her sewing scissors, splinting his leg with strips torn from an old blanket while Caleb built a fire out of broken crate boards. Think about that for a second. This was the same man who had shown up at Caleb's ranch to warn him about her. The same town that had shut its doors on her overnight. And there she was, on her knees in a freezing shack, saving his life without a moment of hesitation. That's the whole heart of this story right there. Grace doesn't wait around for people to deserve it. Hours later, once the deputy had drifted into an uneasy sleep, Caleb sat by the fire and finally said the thing he'd clearly been carrying for 3 years. "My wife died 3 winters ago." Caught fever after a late snowfall. Doctor couldn't cross the pass in time. He paused. I kept thinking, if someone had known what to do. Josephine didn't say anything back. Some things don't need words. She just walked over and pulled the blanket back over the sleeping boy's shoulders, and when she turned around, Caleb was watching her with something new in his face. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Just a door that had been shut for a long time, finally starting to open. By morning the storm had weakened enough to travel, and they brought the deputy back down to Frostbine Hollow together. Word spread fast. The woman the whole town had called trouble was the same woman who'd ridden into a mountain storm and brought their deputy home alive. Things didn't flip overnight. Nobody stood up and apologized. But the next morning, when Josephine walked into the mercantile beside Caleb, conversations didn't stop dead the way they used to. An old ranch wife pressed a basket of eggs into her hands, for the boy, and mentioned, almost shyly, that she'd heard he was doing better. A cattleman who'd once canceled Caleb's hauling contract tipped his hat instead of turning away. Even Ruth Holloway lowered her eyes when Josephine passed the hotel porch. No apology came. None was really expected. Some towns only know how to be sorry quietly, in small gestures instead of words. That evening, the town square filled with lanterns for the yearly winter social before Christmas. Fiddle music drifted through the cold. Josephine almost stayed home. But the boy stood by the stove buttoning his coat, and asked, simply, "You coming?" So she went. Standing near the edge of the crowd, coffee warming her gloved hands, Josephine noticed something had shifted. People nodded at her now. Not warmly yet. But honestly. Across the square, Caleb finished a conversation with the Reverend, looked up, and saw her standing alone under the lantern light. He crossed toward her without any hurry at all. "You hiding from the dancing?" he asked. "I've never been much good at it," she admitted. "Neither have I." That seemed to settle it. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a long second, then placed hers into his. They moved clumsily at first. He was too tall, she was too careful, but after a few turns they found a rhythm simple enough not to have to think about. When the song ended, he asked her to walk with him. They left the music behind and followed the snowy road out past the church fence, until the ranch lights came into view faint in the distance below the ridge. Caleb stopped there and looked toward home for a long moment before he finally spoke. "That room stopped being spare the day you walked into it. No grand speech. No rehearsed line. Just one quiet sentence hanging white in the cold air between them." Josephine felt the breath leave her chest. She blinked hard, snow gathering on her lashes, and Caleb noticed and pretended not to, and slowly reached for her hand. She let him take it. And for the first time in years, Josephine Hart did not feel the urge to run. Spring came slowly to the territory that year. Snow pulled back off the lower pasture first, then the southern road opened up again, then green grass started pushing stubborn through the thawing ground around Whitfield Ridge. One warm morning, Josephine stepped onto the porch carrying her old suitcase, the same one that had been thrown into the snow on the worst night of her life. She stopped cold. Beside the kitchen window, Caleb had built something new during the last weeks of winter without ever mentioning it to her. A small room with fresh pine boards, 2 wide windows, shelves lined carefully along the wall. A hand-painted sign hung by the door, "Miss Hart, Remedies and Care." Inside sat a sturdy examination table he'd built by hand, fresh towels, rows of herb jars, a little black stove already warming the room. The boy ran laughing across the yard chasing the young colt through the wet spring grass. Caleb looked up from the fence he was mending. Their eyes met across the pasture. Josephine glanced down once at the suitcase still hanging from her hand. Then, quietly, almost without deciding to, she set it down beside the porch wall. And left it there. To anyone passing by, it would have looked like nothing. Just an old suitcase resting against a weathered porch in the Montana spring. But for Josephine Hart, It was the first time in years she had stopped preparing to disappear. Here's why I think this story sticks with people. Most of us know exactly what it feels like to stand outside a room, bracing for judgment before anyone's even said a word. To keep one hand near the door, just in case. To hold on to the suitcase, literally or in your own head, because life has taught you that staying too long always ends the same way. And maybe you also know what it feels like when one person breaks that pattern. Not with some big speech. Just a fire lit before dawn. A door hinge fixed at midnight so it won't rattle all night. A horse ready in the cold so you don't have to ride alone into whatever's coming next. Caleb didn't save Josephine. That's not really what this story is about. What he gave her was something bigger than rescue, a place where she finally didn't have to stay ready to run anymore. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside this whole thing. Healing isn't about forgetting what happened to you. It's about finally finding people who make it easier to carry. So here's my question for you before you go. Is there a suitcase you're still keeping packed? A room you're standing outside of, bracing for a door to shut in your face? And if someone offered you a spare room tonight, no questions asked, would you have the courage to walk in? Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from, and which part of this story hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories like this one, quiet strangers, frozen towns, and hearts that finally find their way home, stick around. There's a lot more road left to travel.